All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Joel Elisea. I'm the president of the Harvard Federalist Society. We're a group of moderate, conservative, and libertarian law students that stands for three principles: that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of powers is central to our Constitution, and that it's in fact the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is and not what it should be. We are very grateful to the Milbank Tweed Conference Fund for funding this event and making it possible. The food is late, as you are aware. It will be coming shortly and will be set up in those last two rows there. So when it arrives, please just make your way over. And I'm sorry that that'll be a little disruptive of the proceedings, but we can't help that the food was a little bit late. Before I begin, I would like to read a statement by Dean Minow, Dean of Harvard Law School, that she has provided for me to read at the opening of this conference on intellectual diversity and the legal academy. So this is Dean Minow. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. John Stuart Mill's insight carries importance for any place of learning and special significance for a law school. For one cannot truly understand a legal argument on behalf of one client or side without thoroughly understanding and addressing competing arguments and objections. Even if there were no other reasons available, this would supply sufficient basis for a robust commitment to intellectual diversity among the faculty and students, courses and journals, activities and speakers at Harvard Law School. But there are other powerful reasons to pursue and nurture intellectual diversity at Harvard Law School. We recruit extraordinary students and work hard to equip them to pursue great careers and great dreams. Both in honing their aspirations and equipping them to achieve them, nothing works as well as serious intellectual encounters with smart and motivated individuals with varied viewpoints. Faculty and students also advance knowledge in law reform through scholarship and public service. Here, too, debates within and across groups deepen scholarship and test law reform ideas. It would be wonderful if one did not have to leave Harvard Law School to discover objections and improvements to descriptions and revisions of financial institution behavior, consumer product safety, national security strategies, federalism, and constitutional adjudication, just to name a few current subjects of research and reform work. But it will suffice if being at Harvard Law School affords faculty and students with super preparation for any ideas and concerns that may be encountered elsewhere. This is the path of truth-seeking. This is the method of iterative improvement. Yet there is at least one more crucial reason for placing priority in intellectual diversity within this institution. The bet made by commitments to the rule of law and to democracy is that we can use reason and participatory institutions to govern diverse and often contentious individuals and groups. That bet cannot prevail without cultivation of leaders who set the example for civil and curious engagement across all kinds of divides, be they defined by race, region, class, language, political party, gender, ideology, or other signifiers of difference. Modeling and cultivating honest and engaged discussion across lines of difference is not only our best practice, it is our commitment to make good on the privileges that the Harvard Law School enjoys, reflects, and bestows. John Stuart Mill also wrote, "In all intellectual debates, both sides tend to be correct in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny." I am not sure he is right, but I think we will make more progress testing this and many other propositions in the company of talented people who draw sustenance from varied and clashing intellectual resources. We may even find surprising points of agreement and convergence, but we would not even know of this wonderful possibility in the absence of intellectual diversity. We're very grateful to Dean Minow for her support for this conference and for her statement in support of intellectual diversity. I'll now introduce our moderator for this first panel. This panel is on problem: is there a lack of intellectual diversity in the legal academy? David Barron is the Honorable S. William Green Professor of Public Law at Harvard Law School. He received his undergraduate degree at Harvard College and his JD from Harvard Law School before clerking for Justice John Paul Stevens on the U.S. Supreme Court. He recently served as Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel in the Obama administration and currently serves as the chair of the entry-level hiring committee here at Harvard Law School. Professor Barron, thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you everybody for coming. Those in the back, if you want to take a seat, there's plenty of seats, and not only right up front, if that makes it easier to sit. So I want to thank Joel, and I want to thank my fellow panelists who I'm going to introduce in a second. Mark Tushnet was just pointing out to me, this panel is actually quite crucial, because if it turns out there's no problem, we have a difficulty going forward. But I think what we want to do today is talk about, if there is a problem, what's the nature of that problem? What's the scope? how do we define it? What do we mean by these terms, intellectual diversity, so that we can set the table for a discussion for the panels to come. So to that end, let me introduce our three panelists, and I'll introduce them in a reverse order, I think, from the way that they'll be speaking. So to start with, let me introduce the panelists next to me, Mark Tushnet, who's the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School, clerk to Justice Marshall, Thurgood, that is, and a noted expert in constitutional law and comparative constitutional law as well. At the far end of the table is another colleague of mine, Jack Goldsmith, who's the Henry Shattuck Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School, who writes on a wide variety of topics ranging from national security law to conflicts of law, and who, before coming to Harvard Law School, was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel from 2003 to 2004, and before that, a Special Counsel to the Department of Defense. And our last panelist, and who will kick us off, is James Lindgren, who's a professor of law at Northwestern Law School and a leading empirical scholar in the country, and also, of all of us, the one who has studied, I think, this question the most closely and the most empirically. And so he's going to start us off by giving us an introduction to the nature of the problem as he sees it, based on the numbers that he's come up with.
Well, I'll just start by reviewing some of the things that are out there, and I basically wanted today to deal with some of the counter arguments. But I did a survey of the top 100 law faculties in 1993-94, 710 respondents, a 66% response rate. By comparison, the typical opinion poll today gets less than a 10% response rate. Nate Silver, the 538 blogger, estimates that some polls actually get, Rasmussen, he says, probably gets 1 or 2% response rate. So 66% response rate. And 13.2% disclosed that they were Republicans or lean Republicans, and 80.4% Democrats or lean Democratic. Then there was a study done by my colleague John McGinnis looking at donations. 29% of law professors had made donations of $200 or more. 15% were exclusively to or predominantly to Republicans, and 81% exclusively or predominantly to Democrats. So virtually identical numbers. So we have numbers from donation patterns, and we have numbers from surveys, and they pretty much match. Deborah Jones Merritt did a survey of entry level in the 90s, 6 years of entry level. They disclosed 10% disclosed they're conservative, 75% liberal. Again, a very similar kind of number. And then Phillips has done research on entry levels from 2005 to 2009, looking at their resumes and their publications and who they work for and whatever, trying to disclose their, trying to figure out whether they lean right or left, and found similar numbers of Republican conservatives, fewer with Democrats or liberals, in part because there were people he couldn't assign one to one or the other. So it's remarkably consistent. In looking over to see whether there's anybody who claimed that there was a diversity, I really could only come up with one person, and that was Brian Leiter, who was, I think, invited and declined to come. He was responding in part to McGinnis's survey, and McGinnis's survey, which was based on donation patterns, found that only 12% of the Texas faculty had donated to Republicans. And he looked at his faculty, and from what he knew, of the 53 that he knew, he said that 32% were Republican. I've been redoing that over the last week, and as near as I can tell, the right answer is somewhere in between, and that Leiter's probably actually closer to the number than McGinnis's was for Texas. But then there's always variation. But then he also said there's no doubt the Academy is the left of society at large. There's also no doubt that views to the right of society at large are better represented in the Academy than anywhere else. I found that quite surprising. So one of the things I wanted to look at is how the 80% law professors compared to other professions. So I looked at the General Social Survey, which, by the way, gets a 70% response rate. It is the best omnibus survey done in the world. These are all 144 occupations from 2000 to 2010 that had at least 50 respondents. So there are many occupations that had fewer than 50. But of the 144 occupations, the highest was psychologists at 70%, then educational counselors, we see social workers, even economists, librarians, and you see lawyers down there as number 11. But that's way, at 58%, still much, much less than law professors. Now, another way of looking at it is least Republican. It isn't exactly the same thing, but again, we see that law professors would be the most extreme profession listed. Now, just what are the most Republican professions? Securities, financial, sales occupations, industrial engineers, clergy, and you see I went down to 16 on this one because current member of the armed forces was 15th. And then we see on least Democratic, we see the current member of the armed forces is now up to a third in terms of the least Democratic occupations. The one claim that's made is that the reason that there aren't more law professors is because Republicans are stupid, I won't bother to give you a litany of who said that. But the General Social Survey actually has a mini IQ test on it. It's actually a vocabulary test, which is shown to correlate extremely highly with overall IQ scores. And Republicans, over the period they've been doing it, 1978 to 2012, got 6.1 questions correct out of 10, and Democrats got 5.6 questions correct. Now, Democrats are catching up in 2006 to 2012. They're getting closer, but they still have not reached Republican levels on IQ tests. What about conservatives? Well, here it's a slightly different story. You see that liberals do score higher than conservatives on IQ tests, 6.1 versus 6.0. And this difference has been broadening in the last few general social surveys. Then what about liberal Democrats versus conservative Republicans? Conservative Republicans over the whole period scored higher, and over the in the last 6 years, 7 years, they've basically tied in scores with conservative Republican 1/100th of a point higher, which is obviously that's not significant. The other relationships I mentioned are all significant. Then another thing that's said is, well, there's self-selection because Republicans don't want to make lots of money and Democrats don't. Well, this again is a question that's been studied in the general population, not on prospective law professors. And they asked them to rate aspects of a job and asked them which do you value most? Do you rank one first, second, third? One is high income, no danger of being fired, working hours are short, lots of free time, chances for advancement, work important and gives a feeling of accomplishment. And on that, it turns out that the Democrats are closer to 1, ranking 1. They have 2.59. Republicans 2.66, which isn't a very big difference. This is really a trivial difference, but it is statistically significant. And then you find the same thing with liberals and conservatives. Liberals are more likely to want high income, and same for conservative Republicans versus liberal Democrats. So it's a myth, at least for the general public, that that's so. What about those with graduate professional degrees only? And here, the numbers get a lot smaller because there's obviously most people don't have graduate professional degrees. And on this, the Republicans do score somewhat lower, but it's not statistically significant. So there is no significant difference between the two if you look just at graduate and professional degrees, though the point estimate is in favor of Democrats on this one. And then another is that Democrats are supposedly more altruistic. And the General Social Survey has an altruism scale, which has been asked in 2002, 2004, and 2006. Now, I don't agree with some of these items as being altruistic. I don't think giving food or money to a homeless person is necessarily altruistic, but nonetheless, I didn't want to pick and choose the ones I agreed with. I wanted to go with what they thought were counted as altruism. So it's things like returning money after getting too much change, doing volunteer work for a charity, giving money to a charity, looked after the plant or pets of others while they're away, and letting someone borrow an item of value. And here, again, Republicans are more altruistic in their behavior. Conservatives are more altruistic than liberals, and conservative Republicans are more altruistic than liberal Democrats. So some of these arguments that are raised for why you would find this difference, at least in looking at the general public or at those with graduate and professional degrees, do not seem to bear out. My guess is that if there are differences in the relation to that, what's been hypothesized, that they tend to be fairly small and could not be large enough to explain these kinds of differences. So discrimination, my opinion is that there is some discrimination on faculty hiring, and I've seen it even at schools like my own at Northwestern that has about 1/3 people who lean right. Two superb candidates in the last 10 years I know were denied because of politics. And I say that one of them, I was appointments chair that year, so I know why someone was denied. And the person who was able to talk the dean out of giving an offer after a unanimous vote of the faculty openly said that she was doing it because she thought there were too many conservatives in public law on our faculty. And then another person we lost to another faculty, a junior person, who did some non-PC work, and now he's one of the stars at one of the other top 15 schools. But I should say I don't think there's any discrimination on tenure. Once people are in the institution, people are nice, and they get along with people, and they're treated decently. And also, conservatives tend to do conventional work in the sense of use conventional methods. I don't even say conventional work. They use conventional methods, and so they don't get into some of the trouble that occasionally people who are not using conventional methods do. So I don't really see discrimination against conservatives on tenure, certainly not very much of it. And then I'm running out of time, so I won't go through the rest of it, but I should mention that when we talk about, I've been talking about political diversity, but there are other kinds of diversity, and one should remember that over 25% of the US population are fundamentalist Christians. And I looked at which professions, the smallest numbers in professions were about 7%. I would guess that if there were 7% on the Harvard faculty, if you have a faculty of 90, you're basically talking about 6 fundamentalist Christians. I'd be very surprised if there's more than one, or even one. And this is pretty much mirrored of most of the other top law schools. Thank you.
Okay, let's come back to regular order. And if those in line, Jack's going to start his presentation. He'll go for about 10 minutes, and then Mark will, and then I'll have a few questions, and we'll turn it over to the audience. But Jack.
Thanks, David. So Jim talked about numbers, and I'm going to premise my talk on my experiences in the academy for 20 years and at Harvard Law School for 11 years. So in truth, I haven't thought deeply about this topic until 2 or 3 days ago. Of course, I've thought about it to some extent since I've been in the academy. But talking about intellectual diversity is harder. It's harder to pin down what the problem is and what to do about the problem, and it's hard to identify the problem. So I'm going to start by just making some distinctions and narrowing what I want to say. And also, I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to speak in generalizations and somewhat tersely. So I think the premise of this conversation is about left-right diversity in law schools. There are all sorts of diversity problems in law schools if one believes, and this is an assumption that one might question, that law schools should reflect society in general, or even if one doesn't believe that, there are all sorts of diversity problems that I'm just not going to talk about. I'm going to try to talk about just left-right diversity problems, and in general, whether minimally acceptable intellectual diversity extends to conservative legal ideas. I want to further limit my remarks to what I'll call public law, by which I mean generally constitutional law, international law, administrative law. At Harvard, anyway, there's generally robust, I believe that there's generally robust intellectual diversity, or at least much more so, I should say, on the private law side than on the public law side. I don't know the extent to which that's true at other law schools. I think it's a general truth in other law schools, but I'm not sure. But in any event, I'm going to limit my remarks to public law. Another problem is to try to figure out what conservatism is. In the public law academic world, conservatives tend to be thought of as wooden originalists who love guns and love the Second Amendment and love states, hate Roe versus Wade, hate the New Deal, hate the federal government, don't much like equality, at least understood in progressive terms, and would, if they could, turn back the clock in various ways. There are conservatives like this, and they are the ones most disliked and most caricatured in law schools, most law schools, I think. And I think they're the most, that kind of caricature is the most threatening to law school cultures. But as any federal society meeting makes clear, there are many, many stripes of conservatism and many clusters of conservative ideas that mix and match in different ways, so it's hard to speak in general terms. The problem, I think, is that all of those ideas and all of those stripes are underrepresented in public law faculties in this country. In the public law realm that I know best, certain conservative ideas ranging from textualism to originalism to various forms of skepticism about government regulation, these ideas are very important and consequential in the worlds of legal practice and in the world of legal politics and congressional politics. So too, to a lesser degree, and I'm going to basically set this aside, are ideas grounded in natural law and related theories. But even though important in the real world, these ideas don't have nearly consonant, nearly proportional importance in the legal academy, including at Harvard Law School, at least in my experience. Most of my public law colleagues think that originalism and textualism and natural law are bunk, and they exalt the virtues of progressivism and living constitutionalism in the Supreme Court. To a less certain degree, I think there's a little bit more range of opinion on this. They tend to hold progressive views on the virtues of regulation, but on that, I think I'm less sure about that. Now, I assume, but I don't know, that teaching reflects these views, but reflects these commitments to some degree, but I actually don't think that's a very sound assumption. It's probably a plausible assumption, but I don't think we can assume it across the board, and I'm going to come back and talk about that in a moment. Now, just speaking from my own personal experiences, a great many of the intellectual discussions that I participated in my 9 years at Harvard, over lunch and in workshops and in committee meetings and in other contexts, they just start from what I would call deeply progressive premises. It's just most of the conversations around this place begin from those premises, in my experience. My colleagues are usually, I don't want to overstate the point. There are a lot of conversations that don't have any ideological content, but a lot of them do, and they tend to start from sort of unreflective progressive premises. My colleagues are often entirely unaware of this, at least I think they are, but I often find myself thinking that I don't share some basic premise of the argument that everyone else in the room seems to accept. So this, what we might call the second-class status of conservative ideas manifests itself in other ways. Sometimes I see it in open hostility to conservative ideas or to conservatives in the classroom. I hear this from students a lot. Sometimes in condescending dismissals of the opinions of Justice Scalia and especially Justice Thomas. Sometimes in the tokenization of conservative ideas in workshop schedules and workshops. Sometimes with the assumption that everybody in the room is a Democrat. That happens a lot. It's awkward for me. And Jim was talking about whether Republicans are stupider than Democrats or conservatives are stupider than liberals. Never heard that claim made, but I did have what appeared to be a serious conversation with a colleague my first year here about whether conservatives like to read as much as liberals, and he was insistent that they didn't. So I can't prove any of these claims. These are just my experiences, and I might be wrong, and I'm sure I have my own biases and maybe insecurities, but and I'm confident that some of my progressive colleagues wouldn't agree with this. But to the extent that what I'm saying is true, then I think we should all agree, for reasons that Dean Minow gave in her statement that Joelle read, that these forms of intellectual intolerance, I think, are bad for our community. The intellectual diversity problem is often talked about in terms of numbers, and Jim was talking about it in terms of numbers of people on the faculty, and that's a shorthand way for talking about it. And the numbers do, I think, indicate a problem, but the explanation for the numbers is really hard to pin down. Is it bias? I think there's a little bit of that, at least at the entry level, as Jim says. Is it self-selection? I think there's something of that. Is it a judgment on the merits? I tend to think not, but of course the merits, what counts as the merits of scholarship, is itself a contested idea full of biases. So whatever the source of the numbers problem, I don't think that the solution to intellectual diversity problems should be seen simply in terms of hiring more conservative and libertarian legal scholars, which is the way that this conference was described. The extension, I mean, I think that everyone, and conservatives especially, should be careful about extending to conservatives intellectual tokenization and identity scholarship. I mean, I don't think we want to think about making progress in those terms. I don't think that's the best way to think about how to go forward. Now, in terms of the consequences of what I see as this problem, I actually worry somewhat less for myself and people like me, sort of senior faculty members. If anything, I think I've benefited from this. And I was, lucky enough to be asked to come to Harvard Law School, probably some tokenization, if not a lot of tokenization in that. But I think my scholarship has benefited from it enormously. I mean, to have my questions constantly premised, my premise is constantly questioned, has been a good thing for my scholarship, and I like it, and I've grown to expect it. And I actually think, and I'm really speaking in extremely broad general terms here, that it's my progressive colleagues who tend to be more in an echo chamber, talking to themselves, not having their assumptions questioned. I think they're the ones that are, in some sense, harmed by this. The students, so I don't worry about that issue as much as I do the students. And the students in the classroom are a different matter because it's where legal intellects are first shaped, and it's where diversity of ideas is most important and most fruitful. And many conservative students at Harvard Law, even at Harvard Law School, which I think has more conservative students than any law school in the country, in part because we're so big, and it probably has the most robust and largest Federalist Society in the country. And we also have at least token representation, if not a little bit more than token representation, of conservative ideas in the public law faculty. Even here, students are constantly reporting to me that they feel alienated in the classroom. And part of that is student insecurity that cuts across all students, but I think part of it does have a basis of the ideas being floated around the classroom. So given the prominence and importance of conservative ideas in the practice of law, we should insist at a minimum that these ideas be presented, taught, and examined in a fair manner that is empathetic to the ideas, even if it's not sympathetic to them. They should get more of a showing in the classroom. Now, it doesn't follow, and this gets back to the numbers point, that we need more conservatives on a faculty. And again, I try not to think of these things in terms of numbers purely. I try not to have a conservative bias to the extent I'm even conservative on these issues in the classroom and the issues I teach. And I think that most of my colleagues try as well. And I think many of them succeed. And I know that my left of center colleagues are capable of teaching conservative ideas. Many of them I know do it. They do it empathetically. According to my students, and I have reason to believe this is true, Duncan Kennedy, who is not thought of as a conservative member of our faculty, is outstanding at, in an empathetic way, engaging and teaching and grappling with conservative ideas in the classroom. So you don't have to have conservative faculty to let the ideas be out there. To the extent, however, that my colleagues do not and don't want to teach these ideas, these important ideas that students should be exposed to, then I think the law school does need to find people who will do that. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack.
I just wanted to just to give one piece of information. Republicans report reading more fiction than plays or novels than Democrats do.
Send me that study so I can.
That's right. I got it right here. I'll send it to you.
Does that mean Democrats read more nonfiction, or is that just that we're,
Oh,
we don't know
no,
about it?
They didn't ask on nonfiction, or if
Okay.
they did, I haven't found the data. So,
Mark.
Thank you. I want to make 5 points that are divided into 3 sections. I don't have much time, so I'm going to talk very fast. The first are some preliminaries about the scope of the issue with 2 subpoints, and then then there's some supply side issues and demand side issues. So first, preliminaries about the scope of the issue. Jack has already mentioned this, but there's a subject matter scope issue. Mostly it's an issue, if it is one, with respect to public law topics, not private law ones. There may be slight partisan tilts in private law, but they're not huge. And in general, I think, and this echoes something that Jack suggested, that in the absence of, concrete evidence, that on the whole, teachers who tilt one way on these private law issues, who are Democrats on liability, whatever that means, present the tilt the other way reasonably fairly so students get a complete picture. I mean, first of all, I don't even know what, as between Cardozo and Andrews and Paul's graph, I have no idea what the partisan breakdown of views is, or the scope of the business records rule in evidence. So that's one. Incidentally, my guess is, and this is also echoes something Jack said, that some balancing occurs in presentations in public law subjects. Though here my assumption would be that because the partisan tilt is more substantial, the balancing presentations probably don't reduce the tilt as much as they do in private law subjects. Okay. Second issue of scope is, I think, more significant, and it's what I call a question of institutional scope, or whether what we're interested in is within institution diversity, or we have to think about within institution diversity and across institutions diversity. Actually, a priori, I think there's nothing problematic about an institution taking a distinctive line in its hiring and in its the predominant views its faculty members promulgate. Jesuit institutions and a commitment to social justice. I mean, that's fine. Evangelical institutions which focus on mediation rather than litigation. Law and economics as a specialization at some other institution. Now, all of those would reduce within institution diversity, but there is, again, across institution diversity. And when you choose what law school to go to, one component of the choice is the institutional tilt. So, when deciding what law school to go to, you know that there are no conservatives at Yale and there's some at Harvard. There's more theory at Yale and less at Harvard. My sort of snarky version of this is, if you're good enough to get into Harvard or Yale, but you think you might end up in the middle of the class, go to Pepperdine, and you'll be at the top of the class, and you'll be in a more politically congenial location. So it's not obvious to me that given institutional diversity, across institution diversity, it's not obvious that how much of a problem within institution diversity is. Okay, now on supply side issues, one thing Jim mentioned, the most underrepresented group in elite institutions are evangelical Christians. He said fundamentalists. I think there may be differences, and I want to focus on evangelicals. There's a reason for that, which is rooted in evangelicalism itself, and I've suggested it already. Evangelicals have a theologically grounded skepticism about law itself. Love and mercy rather than law. I mean, that's what their theology is. So relative to the general population, there are going to be fewer evangelicals interested in going into law and the legal academy. Again, for reasons rooted in evangelicalism. That is, the supply of evangelicals to legal education is low relative to their presence in the general population. And some of that supply will go to evangelically oriented law schools, which is my across institutions diversity points. I think something similar operates with respect to conservatives conservatism, and in light of some of the general population points Jim made, I want to say that the argument I'm about to make is an argument that's specific to law and the legal academy, and it's not clear to me that you can use the kind of general population or even the graduate degree information to address this. So I assume that conservatives are differentially favorable to business relative to liberals, and specifically to big law practice relative to legal services practices, and similar forms of liberal law practice. If that's so, conservatives face a choice. Conservative law students who are now graduating, they have a choice between a high-paying big law job and a moderately well-paying job in law teaching. Liberals face a choice between a relatively low-paying legal services job and a moderately well-paying job in law teaching. The result is going to be that the supply of conservatives relative to that of liberals to law teaching is going to be low. I'm not saying none or anything like that, but just differentially, you're going to get a selection effect. And that's going to be true, I think, about that. Can be true at all levels of quality. Now, finally, the demand side. Of course, institutions of all sorts try to replicate themselves. If they do that, one consequence of that is that they die. But when you're inside it, that seems like the sensible thing to do. Law schools are predominantly center-left, so they will tend to do center-left hiring. That's, I think it's sort of general institutional phenomenon. That doesn't rule out hiring off the median, and I guess I want to inject a sort of, I don't quite know how to put this, sort of personal point. I sort of feel myself as somewhat removed from this entire discussion, which is sort of, I want to say it's captured by the fact that Jack got to Harvard after how many years in the legal academy?
I don't know how you count, maybe 9?
Okay, it doesn't, 9's good enough. 33 for me.
But Mark, that's just because my scholarship was so much better than yours.
Right, I understand that. I reject that hypothesis. Or at least at some point short of 33, mine was good enough. Okay.
I'll just say I started as an assistant professor, so we can just throw that.
Okay. So they're going to, institutions will tend to do center-left hiring. That doesn't rule out hiring off the median. But I think this is observational, I can't bolster it with any statistics. Suppose that there's something like a normal distribution with its peak from the law school's point of view at the center-left. I'm not saying normal distribution with respect to the entire society, but with respect to law schools, though there's a normal distribution, it's at the center-left. There will be off-median hiring that is towards the tails of the distribution. They won't be fully replicating itself. But I have a pretty strong sense that there's a greater willingness to go further toward the tail on the right than toward the tail on the left. To give you a sense, I don't want to make this an assertion of fact, it's as if faculty are willing to look one standard deviation to the left for new faculty, but are willing to look 1.5 or 2 standard deviations to the right for new faculty. The cutoff on the left is closer in than the cutoff on the right. My personal account for why that happens is the following, though I offer it only as a personal view. Faculties continue to think that one criterion of quality is this ineffable thing called soundness. And given the overall state of American politics, you get to be unsound when you move left more quickly than you get to be unsound when you move to the right, because there's less support in American politics generally for someone who says, I'm a European-style social democrat, than for someone who says, I'm an Ayn Rand-style libertarian. The person who says the former, I'm a European-style social democrat, demonstrates bad judgment, unsoundness. Whereas the person who says the latter, I'm an Ayn Rand libertarianist, demonstrates only something, again, I want to stress, from the center-left's point of view, demonstrates only eccentricity, which is not which is tolerable in faculties, but unsoundness is not tolerable. So yes, there's skewed hiring. It arises for standard institutional kinds of reasons. I think the skew is there are exclusions. I think more rapid in my version of this on the left than on the right, but I have to say, given compensating things within the classroom and the existence of a cross-institution diversity, it actually is not clear to me that there's a problem, notwithstanding the fact that you have a session on the solution to the problem later on.
Jim, you want to comment on?
Yeah, that just.
Could you just focus on, it'd be helpful if in your remarks, so you could talk about the within institution diversity versus across institution diversity. And then Jack, it would be great if you could, when you get to it, if Jim doesn't, what you make of this, the left tail, the tail, yeah.
You asked me to comment on actually the part of Mark's talk that I most agreed with.
Great.
So I wasn't going to say anything about that. I did want to disagree, though, the idea that conservatives who might be law teachers are just interested in making money. Bob Nelson at NYU is no friend to conservatives. In his study, found that more Supreme Court clerks, conservative clerks, went into government than liberal clerks, and so
from 1980 to 2008, right? Right.
Well, okay. I'm not sure which years the study was done. As far as when moving up, I'm a fan of both of your work, and I think that I actually remember, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, saying, why hasn't someplace like Harvard hired Mark? But nonetheless, I think it has more to do with fields. Your field was overloaded, his was more sparse. The general.
Wasn't my scholarship?
No, I said, I paid both of your work. I'm joking. Steve Chevelle said to me one time that for over 20 years, for 2 decades, he said, Harvard failed to hire a single entry-level Republican. That logjam was broken in early 2000. Now, I guess the idea, well, it's not a big problem, which seemed to be the main point of Mark's. Think about it as a thought experiment. Imagine that the Harvard Law School for 20 years hired no entry-level Democrats, only Republicans. Don't you think that the school would look very different? I suspect American government and American society would look very different. I think it absolutely does matter, and the American Constitution Society would be holding this conference and howling louder than the concerns being raised here if the situation were reversed.
Jack.
Yeah, so just responding to Mark's tail point, which I'm not sure I understand. To the extent I understand it, I'm not sure I agree. Just speaking in very general terms and without revealing confidences that I'm not supposed to reveal, my experience on appointments committees is that there aren't any views left of center that are disqualifying implicitly, but there are views on the right that are disqualifying. I mean, if this is my own personal view, but if you had written scholarship about why affirmative action was illegal and immoral, and if you've been working against that for 10 years, you would have, I think, a hard time making it through Harvard Law School at the entry level. I actually think the Ayn Rand example, I don't think that would count as if that was a core part of your constitutional scholarship, I don't think that would be viewed as attractive. And I wouldn't say it would be disqualifying, because that's not the way the conversations take place, but I don't think it would be helpful. And in my experience anyway, and this is a very hard judgment to make, and it's very subjective, and I just want to say that. And the problem with these discussions is the metrics are so hard. But in my experience, the conservatives at the entry level are held to a higher standard. I would say a much higher standard in terms of the quality of their scholarship. Now, in part, that's because, it gets back to my point about, in large part, that's because that the forms of, I believe, that the forms of scholarship that conservatives like to do especially originalism, that they tend to do for whatever their ideological reasons, is not valued in the academy, certainly not valued at Harvard Law School, and it makes it harder, much harder for those types of scholars to make it through. So I'm not sure that's responsive, but that's my experience.
Mark, could you just say a little bit about, before I turn it over to questions, the point Jack has referenced a few times, which is at some level when you're talking about this question, and particularly if it's in terms of discrimination, whether there's a bias against a particular type of scholarship, that it's bound up with some evaluation of the merits of the scholarship. And how can we have a meaningful discussion about this topic given that conundrum in which the people who dislike a particular work are always able to say, well, it's on the merits of the work, I don't like this particular type of work, here's why. I mean, what do we do if to make progress in trying to think through this issue?
First of all, I think the right formulation is, this is universally true, that if you're antecedently unsympathetic to the political coloration of the person that you're considering, and there is work that you're considering, it will always be the case that you can say this work is flawed on the merits independent of my views of the political coloration. This is not good originalist work, for example, or this is not good. This is the method of trying to identify race-based discrimination is flawed as a technical matter. Okay, you can always do that. It is true that you can't disentangle the merits from the political views, but you also can't have a coherent conversation about the merits because the evaluation of the merits is influenced, not expressly, by the political views. There is no paper anybody has ever published that is not subject to severe criticism from within its own premises. There's this great piece by George Stigler called The Workshop. And it's a list of 20 things that you can say at any workshop about what's wrong with the paper that's been given. Adam Smith said it first. There's nothing new here. A whole bunch of things. And that's true universally. So at some level, I guess at some level my reaction is the only way to deal with that is by encouraging a cross-institution diversity.
Okay, let's take questions from the audience, which I'm sure there are many.
I want to ask about the effect of the lack of intellectual diversity on the law school curriculum. Most law professors teach one or two bread and butter courses and then one or two specialty courses that they have their own choosing. And my observation is that in law schools they get an awful lot of classes on race, gender, and sexual orientation. But you don't get a whole lot of specialty courses on topics that are more interest to conservatives, and I wonder what your thoughts are.
I don't know the numbers. I think what you say is probably true, but I haven't studied the curricula to see if it's true. I guess the one question would be whether there's a mismatch between what the faculty is offering and what the students are interested in, and therefore that harms the conservative students because the topics they're interested in aren't offered as much. Harvard Law School, even with its slant, is a very big place with a lot of things offered, so it may be less of a problem here than in other law schools, but I just haven't studied the curricula to know to the extent to which it's true.
Well, I guess I would just say that to take this point all the way is if you posit that there's a problem with intellectual diversity, it would manifest itself in many, many forms outside the classroom or the scholarly engagement. It'll manifest itself in clerkship connections between faculty and potential judges that pathways for students. It'll manifest itself in career networks that the faculty will have relative to what other faculty would have. And it would show up in class selection. It would show up in the research projects that they're working on, and therefore the research opportunities that students would have. So I think if it is a problem, it's going to be a problem that would be present in many, many, many different domains of the law school experience, not just the classroom.
Although maybe some domains more than others for various local reasons.
Yes. Right up front.
So I'm curious to what extent you described, I think all of you.
Speak up and go back.
I think that all three of you described at some point that there's less of an issue with private law. And I'm curious if that mitigates issue to a degree when you consider that the first year students take the bulk of their courses are private law courses. Does that, so their first experience with law school is perhaps a more diverse experience, and they're more able to get their feet on the ground before they face professors who they might not be inclined to agree with.
I think it's entirely too sanguine about private law. There's no question there's a difference. But one of the things, projects I did as part of my PhD was developing I worked on developing a liberal conservative index, which was based on what actually separated the general population. So it'd be normed essentially at 50% would give liberal answers. One of the populations that I gave this survey to was the Midwest Law and Economics Association. And that was a small group, it was 22 people. But except for one person, they all range from giving about 35% liberal answers to 100% liberal answers. There's only one real conservative in the bunch. And that's a Law and Economics Association meeting, which you would think would be one of the most conservative intellectual groups out there. So the median was somewhere around 80% liberal answers. So even among people in fields that are public law that are intellectually diverse, it's still extremely liberal. So in description of law schools as center-left, I think is, it's center-left only in the sense in which law schools think they're center-left. I don't think that they're actually center-left. If you took the kinds of issues that separate liberals and conservatives, you'd find that they pretty much agreed with the liberal side 95% of the time, most of the faculty. And that's not actually center-left.
Yeah.
Question for Mark. I wasn't sure I understood your Pepperdine points. You were suggesting that a student who was smart enough to get into Harvard, but maybe not smart enough to get to the top of the class should consider going to Pepperdine if they're conservative and wanted to experience more conservative mentorship. Was that? I just wasn't sure I understood that.
Yeah, it's a crude, as I said, snarky example. But yeah, there's a package of stuff that you get when you choose institutions. When you choose an institution. If there is a cross-institution diversity, then you shop for the package that makes most sense for you. And if you think that the package includes being politically uncomfortable because you're a conservative and ending up in the middle of the class at Harvard versus being politically comfortable at Pepperdine and ending up at the top of the class, it's not an unsensible decision to go to Pepperdine.
I guess a way.
Pepperdine's got a good faculty. I want to make this clear. I mean, there are a lot of people at Pepperdine whose work I admire. So not to disparage it as an institution. It's ranked lower, yes. You go to Pepperdine and graduate first in the class at Pepperdine, the odds of you're getting a job at, I don't know what the current big law firm is on the East Coast, are slim. But, getting a good job in California with a Pepperdine degree, probably first in the class at Pepperdine, probably pretty good.
I mean, I guess one other way to think about that question is when you think about the top ranking law schools, right? Large-scale national law schools in the highest rank, should they be thinking about themselves in terms of, well, as long as there's within a cross-school diversity somewhere, they can have whatever mission they want, or is that not a healthy thing? I take it that's Jim's the force of Jim's question when he says, if you imagine Harvard Law School over a course of 50 years producing, which it may well have done for some periods, people of a different ideological stripe than they're producing, he contends, today, would that be of concern? I think the force of the question is because of the nature of what these elite law schools are to the legal culture generally, and that can't be answered by saying, well, there's some other school not at that rank who offers a different package. Is that the idea, Jim?
I guess.
Or do you not have that? I mean, or do you think that it's
I'm just
actually
saying,
that Mark's answer? You said you sort of agreed with Mark.
I view it problematic for what's implied in your question. You essentially gave a bit of a critique in that question. The problem, if really there were lots of other schools at similar rank who were politically diverse, then you could say that's fine. I just think as a principle, I agree with Mark, which is to say that I don't think every institution has to look the same. I think there's some advantage in having more than token representation of other views, but I actually think that specialization can be good for institutions. At least it's good for knowledge, and so I agree with Mark on that. I just am not sanguine that there are that many other schools out there that people could go to. And I was looking last night at the Harvard Magazine article about the briefs that were filed in the recent Supreme Court case. And the statements made in the briefs, one was filed by the deans of Yale and Harvard Law School, another by the universities, of which Harvard was one of them. And they would talk about, that we need to think in different ways about themselves and their beliefs. They need to test received truths, to question their own assumptions, to robustly debate ideas, to facilitate hard discussions of controversial topics. Does anyone really believe that adding, does anyone really doubt that adding conservative Republicans or even moderate Republicans to law faculties like Harvard would greatly increase those kinds of things? I mean, one of the problems and I support affirmative action for students and for faculty, and the logic is less on the diversity side because I don't think that necessarily it leads to more diversity of views, but really because people were locked out and they were discriminated against, and things that were related to that on the remedial side.
Steve Calabrese. I wanted to ask Mark a question. I think the idea of cross-school diversity is very interesting and appealing. I have two reservations that I wanted to ask about. The first is the cross-school diversity approach is one that encourages conservatives and libertarians to ghettoize themselves, to sort of stay within a world where they're only in contact with conservatives and libertarians. So such students might go to George Mason or Pepperdine, they might clerk for certain particular judges, they might work at certain particular firms, but they'll be basically in an echo chamber world of their own. Conversely, liberal students at schools will be in a world of their own, with their own sets of judges they clerk for, and their own firms that they work for. And it could be that nationally this discourages a sense of community and an exchange of ideas. And that brings me to the second part of the question, which is, I don't think it's really very realistic to hold out Pepperdine as an alternative to the top 20 schools. It's a fact at the moment that 6 of the Supreme Court justices did their first year here at Harvard Law School. The other 3 justices are graduates of Yale Law School. I don't know of any Pepperdine faculty who've ever made it to the Supreme Court or even to the Courts of Appeals, but there is a real way in which the top 20 schools are very different from Pepperdine or George Mason.
So on the first point, again, this is sort of snarky, but the observation leads to a more directed economy than I would think that you'd be comfortable with, right? Because you're saying there has to be some regulatory solution to these problems of choice that people make.
I wouldn't advocate a regulatory solution. I would advocate individuals deliberately going to schools where they know their ideas will be challenged.
So that's fine with me too. I mean, that's okay. On the second point, you know, I'm a lefty on these things, right? So sure, that's a bad thing, but that's a bad thing about the structure of American society generally. Okay.
Last question, Todd.
I'm a little bit unhappy about framing this as Democrats versus Republicans, because it seems to me that given the scope of things that have been thought about the way to organize politics or society, or even the scope of things that are thought throughout the world on those subjects now, Democrats and Republicans are actually very close to each other compared to the range of things that could be thought. Scalia and Breyer are in the same mental universe with small differences between them compared to much more radical thoughts about how society should be organized on either side. I mean, it seems to me if we really want diversity, it's not that we want someone who argues for that in a 5-4 decision, the 4 was right and the 5 was wrong, or the other way around. It's we want people who say in a 9-0 decision, all 9 of them are wrong. And that, I think that going way out on the tail is very important to take talks looking at it, rather than arguing about exactly where we are in the middle of the distribution.
I don't disagree with that at all. It's another way of getting at it. I think the tail at Harvard Law School, anyway, is much farther to the left. There's much more questioning and fundamental questioning going on from the left and the right. So I think the point still holds, even if you look at it that way.
I think the problem that I see with that argument is that if you look at leaning left or leaning right or leaning Republican or leaning Democrat, it really understates the problem rather than mischaracterizes it. In other words, how many I remember one professor saying if you took the Democratic Party and divided it into thirds, and this was date somewhat the example, but they said, Bill Clinton would be between the middle third and the right third. Hillary Clinton would be between the right third and the middle third and the left third. And almost all the law professors would be in the left third. Think about an issue like gay marriage. Until just a couple years ago, a majority of Democrats opposed gay marriage or thought that homosexual intercourse was always wrong. You can look in the Federalist Society and you'll find plenty of people who don't think homosexual behavior is wrong or that favor gay marriage. You don't find that level of diversity on the left. So I think looking at a Democratic Republican, it's true, it's misleading, but it's because it's a lot worse than that in terms of the overall representation.
Okay, I want to thank Mark and Jack and Jim for kicking off the conference with a take on what the nature of the problem is, and I know that the other panels will then explore how it might be addressed and whether there is a solution to the problem, however it's understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, David.